The skies over Europe were darkening, thick with the contrails of the Luftwaffe and the promise of a war unlike any the world had seen. In the halls of power in Washington, D.C., the machinery of American industry was beginning to stir, preparing to unleash a storm of steel and fire. But within the heart of this burgeoning superpower festered a profound and, to its enemies, a baffling contradiction. As the nation prepared to fight for freedom abroad, it systematically denied that very freedom to a significant portion of its own citizens. It was in this cauldron of prejudice and necessity that the story of the Tuskegee Airmen began, not as a celebrated unit, but as an experiment. An experiment that the United States Army Air Corps never truly wanted. The prevailing wisdom of the era, a toxic blend of long-held racism and deeply flawed science, insisted that black men were inherently inferior. They were caricatured as lacking the intelligence, the courage, the reflexes, and the moral fortitude to operate complex machinery like an aircraft, let alone possess the tactical acumen for aerial combat. A notorious 1925 Army War College report codified this bigotry, stating flatly that the black man was a subspecies of the human population and that his social and psychological inadequacies made him unfit for leadership or combat roles. This was the bedrock belief upon which the military stood. Black soldiers were largely relegated to service and labor roles, cooks, drivers, and stevedores. The idea of them as pilots was, to their high command, a joke in poor taste. But external pressure began to mount. The threat of a massive march on Washington led by civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph forced President Franklin D. Roosevelt's hand. In a political calculation, the War Department reluctantly agreed to create a black flying unit to prove, once and for all, what they already believed to be true, that it would fail. This was the genesis of their Tuskegee Experiment. The location itself was symbolic. Tuskegee, Alabama, deep in the Jim Crow South, was chosen not for its ideal flying conditions, but because it was home to the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black university. It was a place where, the Army hoped, the experiment could be contained and controlled, far from the integrated northern bases where it might cause unrest. The first cadets who arrived at Tuskegee Army Airfield were not just aspiring pilots, they were walking, talking rebuttals to a nation's prejudice. They were among the brightest their communities had to offer, college graduates, engineers, men of profound intellect and unshakable determination. They were men like Captain Benjamin O. Davis Jr., a West Point graduate who had endured 4 years of silencing, where not a single white cadet would speak to him outside of duty, and emerged not broken, but hardened into a leader of iron will. He was the living proof that black men could not only survive but excel in the most rigorous academic and military environments. Yet, from the moment they set foot on the base, the experiment was designed to make them fail. Their white commanding officers and instructors, many of whom were openly hostile to their mission, subjected them to a constant, grinding pressure. The standards for entry and graduation were set impossibly high, far higher than for their white counterparts at other flight schools. A single minor mistake in the air, a slight deviation on a written test, was often grounds for immediate washing out. The cadets had to be more than perfect, they had to be flawless. Every takeoff, every landing, every maneuver was not just a test of skill, but a defense of their entire race. The weight of millions of black Americans, watching and hoping, rested on their young shoulders. The training aircraft, the PT-17 Stearman and the BT-13 Valiant, became their sanctuaries and their proving grounds. In the air, the color of their skin vanished. All that remained was the stick, the rudder, the horizon, and the relentless pursuit of mastery. They flew until their muscles ached, studied until their eyes burned, building a foundation of skill so solid that no prejudice could shake it. They were learning to fight 2 wars simultaneously, one against the Axis powers in Europe, and another against the entrenched bigotry at home. When the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first ever black fighter squadron, was finally declared combat ready, the Army didn't know what to do with them. They were a political creation, an unwanted stepchild. Deployment was delayed under flimsy pretexts. More tests were ordered. The whispers followed them, they'll crack under pressure. They'll turn tail and run. Their white pilots at nearby bases would often mock them, laughing at the very notion of Negro pilots defending them in combat. Finally, in the spring of 1943, the 99th was shipped out to North Africa, not to the heart of the air war in Europe, but to a secondary theater. They were equipped with Hamadan P-40 Warhawks, aircraft already considered obsolete against the latest German fighters. They were sent on low-risk missions, ground attack and patrols, their every move scrutinized for failure. The initial reports from their white commanders were dismissive, criticizing their performance and seeking any excuse to declare their experiment a failure and disband the unit. This was the crucible. This was their experiment they never wanted. They were set up to fail, trained to impossibly high standards, mocked by their own countrymen, given outdated equipment, and sent to a theater where they were expected to fade into obscurity. The German pilots they would soon meet had not yet heard of them, and if they had, they too would have likely laughed. But the men of the 99th, and the larger 332nd Fighter Group that would follow, were not laughing. They were internalizing every slight, every doubt, every ounce of condescension. They were forging a silent, burning resolve. The laughter was about to meet the one force that could silence it, undeniable, exceptional, and hard-won excellence. The experiment was entering its most critical phase, combat. And the results would shock the world. The Mediterranean sun beat down upon the cracked, dusty tarmac of the airfield in North Africa, a stark and unforgiving contrast to the humid greenery of Alabama. For the pilots of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, their arrival in the spring of 1943 was not the glorious entry into the war they had envisioned. They were not sent to the storied airbases of England to join the great aerial armadas pounding the heart of the Reich. Instead, they were relegated to what the military brass considered a secondary theater, a place where the Tuskegee Experiment could be tested with minimal consequence. Their aircraft, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, were already obsolete, outclassed in every performance metric by the German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s they would inevitably face. These machines were hand-me-downs, a physical manifestation of the War Department's lingering doubt. Their message was clear: they were being given a chance, but a carefully circumscribed one, designed to confirm pre-existing prejudices rather than shatter them. Their initial combat assignments were deliberately mundane, a source of immense frustration for the highly trained pilots. They flew endless armed reconnaissance patrols along the coastline, strafed enemy transport columns on dusty roads, and provided low-altitude cover for coastal shipping convoys. The real war, the war of high-altitude dogfights and strategic bomber escorts, seemed to be happening elsewhere. The white pilots of other squadrons, and even the bomber crews they were occasionally tasked to protect, would often regard them with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. Radio calls back to base sometimes contained thinly veiled unease, questioning the capability of their colored escorts. The Luftwaffe remained an abstract threat, a name heard in intelligence briefings but not yet a tangible enemy in their gunsights. Each uneventful mission deepened the sense of purgatory. They were in a combat zone, yet they were not allowed to truly combat the most dangerous foe. The pressure built not from enemy flak or fighters, but from the agonizing wait for a chance to prove their worth, a chance that seemed it might never come. That chance arrived with sudden, violent clarity during a mission to provide cover for a formation of Allied bombers targeting strategic positions in Sicily. The flight had been routine, the droning of the engines a monotonous lullaby. Then, the calm shattered. From high above, diving out of the blinding sun with terrifying speed, came a swarm of German Bf-109s. This was the moment of truth. The sterile diagrams of the briefing room and the choreographed maneuvers of training evaporated, replaced by the deafening roar of engines at full throttle, the sharp smell of cordite, and the terrifying, beautiful arcs of tracer fire stitching patterns across the sky. For the young pilots of the 99th, this was their baptism by fire. The sky, once a vast and empty expanse, transformed into a lethal, three-dimensional chessboard where a single mistake meant death. The engagement was a brutal lesson in the realities of aerial warfare. The P-40s, outmaneuvered and outgunned, were thrown into a desperate, swirling dogfight. The pilots fought with raw courage, calling upon every lesson drilled into them at Tuskegee. But courage alone could not bridge the gap between their aging airframes and the superior German technology. The formation was broken. In the chaotic, whirling combat, several of the 99th's P-40s were shot down. While they had managed to provide enough of a distraction for the majority of the bombers to complete their mission and escape, the cost had been high. The taste of their first major engagement was not one of victory, but of loss and survival. In the aftermath, the blow that fell was not from the Germans, but from their own command. The after-action report filed by their white commander was scathing and damning. It focused not on the successful protection of the bombers under difficult circumstances, but almost exclusively on the squadron's losses. It questioned their aggression, their discipline, and their fundamental competence. The report claimed the pilots had broken formation and shown a lack of combat judgment. It was the evidence the skeptics in the War Department had been waiting for. Here, they argued, was the definitive proof. The experiment had failed. A powerful movement began within the military bureaucracy to have the 99th Pursuit Squadron permanently withdrawn from combat, suggesting its reassignment to mundane patrol duties in Panama or Alaska, a quiet, shameful end to the Tuskegee Airmen. A profound sense of despair settled over the squadron. They had faced the ultimate test and, in their own eyes and in the eyes of their critics, been found wanting. The dream of proving their capability, of forcing a nation to see them as equals, seemed to have died over the Mediterranean. Yet, in this moment of crisis, their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., emerged as their unshakable pillar of strength. Davis, a man who had endured 4 years of silent treatment at West Point for the crime of his skin color, was forged from a different metal. He would not let his men be condemned without a fight. He prepared a meticulous, fiercely logical, and data-driven rebuttal to the damaging report. He argued that the losses were a function of tactical disadvantage and the inevitable chaos of a unit's first major combat engagement, a phenomenon observed in every new squadron, regardless of race. He highlighted instances of individual bravery and sound tactical decisions, defending his men's discipline and fighting spirit. He forced their high command to look at the data, not just the prejudice. Davis's unwavering defense created a crucial stalemate. The War Department, perhaps wary of the political ramifications of disbanding the high-profile unit, granted a stay of execution. The 99th was not sent to Panama. Instead, it was transferred and integrated into the newly formed all-black 332nd Fighter Group, which would soon be joined by the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. More significantly, they began a transition to newer, far more capable aircraft, the powerful P-47 Thunderbolt and, eventually, the magnificent P-51 Mustang. This was not a reward, it was a second chance, offered with the clear understanding that it would be their last. The baptism by fire over the Mediterranean had been a searing, painful, but ultimately transformative ordeal. It had stripped away any remaining illusions of glamour and revealed war in its raw, brutal essence. The pilots of the 99th had learned the hard way that courage was not enough, it had to be paired with experience, superior equipment, and an unbreakable will. They had learned that their performance would be judged by a harsher standard than any other unit. And they had learned that they had a leader who believed in them absolutely. The laughter from their detractors had grown louder after that first costly engagement, but the men who climbed into their new cockpits were different from the ones who had flown the P-40s. They were no longer eager students, they were hardened veterans. The lesson was over. The next time they met the Luftwaffe, they would not be the hunters. They would be the hunters. The transformation began not with a roar, but with a fresh coat of paint. As the P-47 Thunderbolts, and later the sublime P-51 Mustangs, were assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group, the mechanics and crew chiefs, the unsung heroes of the unit, took it upon themselves to mark their territory. With careful, deliberate strokes, they painted the tails of these formidable new aircraft a brilliant, gleaming crimson. It was a practical decision for identification in the heat of a dogfight, but it was also something more, a declaration of pride, a statement of identity. They were no longer just their Tuskegee Airmen, a name tied to an experiment. They were becoming their Red Tails. And with these new tools of war, their mission evolved from a defensive struggle for legitimacy to an offensive mandate for excellence. They were assigned the war's most critical, and most dangerous, escort duty, protecting the heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, on their deep penetration raids into the heart of Fortress Europe. The strategic bombing campaign was the sledgehammer with which the Allies intended to break the back of German industry. But the skies over Germany, Austria, and Romania were the most fiercely defended airspace in the world. A bomber formation was a slow, lumbering target, a feast for the swarms of German interceptors and the deadly, accurate flak from the ground below. For the bomber crews, a mission was a terrifying lottery. Their survival often hinged on the skill and tenacity of the fighter pilots assigned to protect them. Initially, when the Red Tails arrived to shepherd a formation, the bomber crews, hearing the unfamiliar drawl of black pilots over the radio, felt a pang of anxiety. The old prejudices and doubts traveled all their way to 25,000 feet. But the men of the 332nd had a new commander, and a new, unshakable doctrine. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. laid down a law that would become the unit's gospel, its defining characteristic: the bomber is your primary mission. You will stay with the bombers. This was a radical departure from the tactics of other fighter groups, whose pilots often could not resist the temptation to break formation and dive after enemy fighters to score individual kills. These diversions, while adding to personal tallies, left the bombers vulnerable to coordinated attacks. Davis understood that the Red Tails would be judged not by their kill count, but by their success in bringing the bombers home. Theirs was to be a discipline of restraint, a courage measured in patience as much as in aggression. They were to be the bombers' unwavering shield. And so, the legend was forged on long, grueling missions to places like Ploietti, the source of most of Germany's oil, and Berlin itself. The Red Tails would fly in their elegant, weaving patterns above and beside the bomber boxes, their crimson tails creating a protective canopy. When the Luftwaffe struck, it was with a terrifying ferocity. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs would scream down in head-on passes or maneuver for attacks from the rear. The radio would crackle to life with calm, professional calls from the Red Tails: bandits, 10 o'clock high. I'm on this one, blue flight cover the rear. They fought with a methodical precision, breaking up enemy formations, making quick, slashing attacks, but always regrouping and returning to the bombers. They understood the geometry of death in the air, using the superior high-altitude performance of their Mustangs to their advantage. The stories began to circulate among the bomber groups, whispered at first, then proclaimed with fervent gratitude. A B-17 pilot, his aircraft crippled by flak and lagging behind the formation, would watch in despair as German fighters lined up for the kill. Then, like avenging angels, a flight of Red Tails would drop down, placing themselves between the limping bomber and the enemy, fighting a desperate, running battle all their way to the coast. They saw the crimson tails and knew they had a chance. A navigator, his plane shot to pieces, would see a P-51 pull up alongside, the pilot giving a thumbs up, then staying with them. A solitary guardian, until they were safely over the water. The bomber crews, men from every corner of America, began to request the Red Tail Angels. The condescending radio calls ceased, replaced by a new call sign, spoken with respect: "Hello, Red Tails. Good to have you with us." The statistics began to tell the story in cold, hard numbers that even the most skeptical War Department official could not ignore. On one remarkable mission, a deep penetration raid to Berlin, the 332nd Fighter Group encountered a formation of nearly 24 of the Luftwaffe's new jet-powered Me-262s, the most advanced fighter in the world. While other escort groups were drawn away, the Red Tails held firm. In a stunning display of tactical discipline, they managed to shoot down 3 of the revolutionary jets without losing a single bomber to them. The myth of their invincibility grew. The most famous statistic, the one that would define their legacy, was their record on bomber escort missions. Out of the hundreds of bombers they were tasked to protect on their deep penetration raids, only a tiny handful, some records say as few as 25, were ever lost to enemy fighters. This was a loss rate dramatically lower than that of any other fighter group in the theater. The laughter that had once followed them was now silenced, replaced by a new sound: the deep-throated roar of a P-51 Mustang engine, and the grateful cheers of bomber crews who knew the Red Tails in the distance meant they were going to live to see another day. Their red-tailed angels were no longer an experiment. They were not just a competent unit. They were the most reliable, most disciplined, and most feared escort in the entire 15th Air Force. They had turned a symbol of their segregation, the painted tails, into a symbol of hope for the men they protected, and a symbol of dread for the enemies they faced. The legend was no longer something they were building, it was something they lived, with every mission into the heart of the Reich. The air in the ready room was thick with a tension that had little to do with the impending mission. It was March 31, 1945, and for the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, the war had taken on a grim, familiar rhythm. They were veterans now, their confidence forged in the crucible of countless escort missions over targets like Ploietti and Munich. Their P-51 Mustangs, with their gleaming crimson tails, were a known and feared sight in the skies over Central Europe. Yet, a different kind of battle still simmered, a battle of perception. Among some white pilots in other units, particularly the newer, less experienced arrivals, the old jibes and condescending whispers about "those Tuskegee boys" still occasionally circulated. It was a casual, unthinking prejudice, a relic of a mindset that had not yet caught up with the brutal reality of the air war. The laughter, though quieter, had not been entirely extinguished. That was about to change. The mission brief that morning was for maximum effort. Intelligence pointed to a major concentration of Luftwaffe fighters, including the new, formidable Me-262 jet fighters, being gathered at the airfield in Linz, Austria. The Allies could not allow this force to be unleashed. The plan was audacious and incredibly dangerous, a low-level strafing attack. This was not the high-altitude world of bomber escort, this was flying on the deck, at treetop level, through a storm of light and heavy flak to destroy the enemy on the ground. It was a mission that demanded not just skill, but raw courage and a stomach of iron. The risks were astronomical. A single lucky shot from a 20mm anti-aircraft gun, a collision with a tree or a telephone wire, and a pilot would have no time, no altitude to recover. For the Red Tails, it was a chance to prove their versatility and aggression in the most direct terms possible. As the squadrons roared over the Austrian countryside at wavetop height, the pastoral scene below belied the hell that awaited. Approaching the target, the sky ahead began to darken, not with clouds, but with the black puffs of exploding flak. The Germans had thrown a wall of steel into the air. Tracers, glowing a malevolent red and green, streaked up in lazy, arcing lines that accelerated into blinding speed as they neared the aircraft. The world outside the cockpit became a violent kaleidoscope of explosions, smoke, and earth. Flying Officer Charles, Chuck, McGee, leading a flight of Mustangs, felt his aircraft buck and shudder as shrapnel peppered the wings and fuselage. The noise was a constant, deafening percussion, the roar of the engine, the hammer of his own .50 caliber machine guns, and the concussive thump of nearby flak bursts. Through this maelstrom, the Red Tails pressed their attack. They weaved and jinked, their eyes scanning frantically for targets, parked Me-109s, Ju-88 bombers, the sleek, shark-like forms of the precious Me-262s. They made pass after pass, their guns hammering, igniting fuel trucks and tearing apart aircraft in their revetments. The airfield became an inferno. But the cost was steep. Aircraft began to take crippling hits. Pilots radioed damage reports in terse, strained voices. Some planes, trailing smoke and flame, disappeared into the landscape, their fate a grim certainty. It was in the midst of this chaos that the mission's purpose transformed. As the Red Tails regrouped to assess their losses and count their victories, a new call crackled over the radio. It was from a pilot of another, all-white fighter group who had been assigned a different target nearby. His P-51 had been badly damaged by flak. He was lost, low on fuel, and deep behind enemy lines. His voice was tight with the controlled panic of a man staring at capture or death. He was, for all intents and purposes, doomed. Without a moment's hesitation, the response came from the Red Tails frequency. It was Captain Roscoe Brown, leading the 100th Fighter Squadron. "We see you, son. Form up on us." Brown and his wingmen, themselves low on fuel and ammunition after the fierce battle at Linz, altered their course. They found the stricken pilot, his Mustang limping along, and formed a protective box around him. They navigated for him, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain gained from countless missions. They shepherded him across the treacherous Alps, a wounded bird protected by a flight of crimson-tailed hawks. When they reached the safety of the Adriatic Sea, the relief in the rescued pilot's voice was palpable. He was going home. The return to Ramitelli airfield in Italy was somber. They had destroyed a significant number of enemy aircraft on the ground, but they had also lost good men. The debrief was focused and professional. But as the story of the Linz mission and the subsequent rescue began to circulate, something shifted. The tale was not just one of destruction, but of salvation. The pilot they had saved returned to his own unit, a living testament to the character of the men he had once, perhaps, doubted. He told his comrades, his commanders, anyone who would listen, about the flak, the fire, and the crimson-tailed angels who had appeared out of nowhere to bring him home. The laughter stopped that day. It didn't fade, it was severed. It became impossible to maintain the old caricatures in the face of such overwhelming and multifaceted evidence of courage, skill, and humanity. The Red Tails had not just proven they could dogfight, they had proven they could execute one of the war's most dangerous missions and still have the discipline and compassion to save a fellow airman, even at great risk to themselves. They were no longer just the best bomber escorts, they were, unequivocally, some of the finest fighter pilots in the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. The respect they had earned from the bomber crews was now matched by the respect of their fighter pilot peers. The day the laughter stopped was the day the myth of their inferiority was finally, completely, and irrevocably buried under the wreckage of a German airfield at Linz and in the warm waters of the Adriatic, where a lone P-51, and its grateful pilot, made it safely home. The silence that fell over Europe on VE Day, May 8, 1945, was a sound the Red Tails had fought for, yet it was one that felt strangely alien. The relentless roar of engines, the crackle of radio traffic, the distant crump of flak, the symphony of war that had been the soundtrack to their lives for years had ceased. They stood as victors on a scarred continent, their crimson-tailed P-51s lined up on the ramp not as instruments of war, but as relics of a battle concluded. They were coming home. But to what? They were returning to a nation that had sent them to fight for freedom abroad while systematically denying them those same freedoms at home. They had shattered the Luftwaffe over the skies of Europe, now they faced the far more entrenched and insidious enemy of Jim Crow America. The journey back was a jarring reacquaintance with the very prejudices they had defied. After receiving a respectful, professional send-off from their allied counterparts in Europe, they disembarked from ships in New York to a nation largely unaware of their specific achievements. There were no massive ticker-tape parades dedicated solely to the Tuskegee Airmen. They were often subsumed into larger, segregated welcome home ceremonies, if they were acknowledged at all. The stark contrast was immediate and brutal. Captain Charles Hall, who had scored the 99th's first aerial kill, was refused service at a restaurant in his hometown, still wearing the uniform and wings he had earned with blood and valor. Their Double V campaign they had fought for, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home, had only been half won. The battle for recognition, for simple human dignity, was entering a new, more complex phase. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the official military history, written by the same institution that had resisted their creation, initially downplayed their accomplishments. The narrative of their Tuskegee Experiment was quietly shelved, and with the rapid demobilization of the armed forces, the 332nd Fighter Group was inactivated. For 2 decades, the story of the Red Tails risked fading into obscurity, a forgotten footnote in the grand narrative of World War II, known only to the men who lived it and the bomber crews they had saved. They dispersed back into a segregated society, becoming teachers, mailmen, lawyers, and mechanics, carrying their memories privately, their wings tucked away in attics. But a legacy forged in fire is not so easily extinguished. The bonds formed in the skies over Europe held firm on the ground. In the 1950s and 60s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, the Tuskegee Airmen found a new battlefield. Their very existence became a powerful weapon in the fight for equality. When President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces, it was not an act of charity, it was a direct result of the proven performance of units like the Tuskegee Airmen. They were the living, breathing refutation of the argument that black servicemen were inferior. Civil rights lawyers used their record to challenge segregation laws, arguing that if black men could master the complex science of aerial combat and lead men in war, they were clearly capable of voting, attending integrated schools, and living as full citizens. The men themselves became pillars of their communities and active participants in the struggle. They organized, forming the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated in 1972, not as a mere veterans association, but as a dedicated organization to promote their history and inspire young people, particularly in aviation and STEM fields. They began speaking at schools, telling their stories to a new generation that was hungry for heroes who looked like them. They were no longer just war veterans, they were educators, mentors, and living history. The turning point in public awareness came with the dawn of a new millennium. Books, documentaries, and finally, a major motion picture, brought their story to a mass audience. The world finally learned the details of the 15,000 men and women who served as pilots, navigators, bombardiers, instructors, and support staff in the Tuskegee program. Of the over 150 distinguished flying crosses they earned, of the legendary Red Tail escorts that rarely lost a bomber, and of the 66 Tuskegee Airmen who made the ultimate sacrifice, their lives ending not in the embrace of a grateful nation, but in the cold waters of the Mediterranean and the fields of Europe. Their unbreakable legacy is not measured solely in the 112 enemy aircraft they destroyed in the air or the 150 more on the ground. It is not even measured in the countless bombers and crews they saved. Their true, unbreakable legacy lies in the doors they kicked open. Every black astronaut who has looked down on Earth from orbit, every black general leading troops, every black commercial airline pilot in a cockpit, flies in the slipstream of those first Tuskegee Airmen. They proved, with irrefutable courage and impeccable skill, that excellence knows no color. They demonstrated that the only thing truly experimental was the bigotry that had tried to hold them back. They returned from a war for democracy and immediately began the harder work of making that democracy real for themselves and their descendants. The Red Tails did not just change the course of a war, they helped change the course of a nation, proving that courage could indeed shatter the sound barrier of prejudice, leaving an unbreakable legacy that soars through the ages.